So it's great joy to have the keynote speaker, but I'll start with the person who's going to contribute to this conversation first and then introduce the keynote speaker, who will then go on and spend some time to help us unbundle the issue of de-dollarization and de-globalization, the impact for Africa. The other speaker on this panel today is Dr. Arose. He is an academic and policy researcher with expertise in money and technology, government procurement, development planning, macroeconomics, illicit financial flows, and finance. He has authored several CEPR reports on special drawing rights and Latin American economies. He also has a broad policy background and experience in Ecuadorian government and electoral politics. He has served as central bank balance of payments statistician, financial policy advisor at the Ministry of Economic Policy, chief operating officer at the central bank, undersecretary for public investment, deputy secretary for planning at the National Planning Secretariat, general director of the Public Procurement Agency, and minister of knowledge and human talent. There's a lot to say about him, but let me abridge it by saying he has written reports and articles for several civil society organizations on tax justice, economic and social human rights, investor state dispute settlement, and financial transparency. Dr. Arose is a University of Michigan alum and has a FLACSO Ecuador Masters. He obtained his PhD in financial economics from the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Please join me in welcoming him. Can we give him a round of applause? Thank you. And having introduced him, our keynote speaker, him and I have had conversation about this topic today. And he is so keen on breaking it down to the brass tack and making sure that there's a clear understanding on where the direction and focus of Africa should be. So you're in for a good time. But let me introduce him properly. Mr. Fofak is a professional and research economist with over 15 years of experience in academia and international development. He is currently responsible for the macroeconomic and growth program at the World Bank Institute, the knowledge and research arm of the World Bank Group. His interest is primarily in development economics, growth, banking and finance, science, and technology. Mr. Fofak is the founder of the Nelson Mandela Institution for Knowledge Building and the Advancement of Science and Technology in Sub-Saharan Africa, an independent, groundbreaking African initiative to enhance the development of Africa through the promotion of excellence in science, engineering, and their applications. Mr. Fofak holds an advanced degree in international economics and finance from France, a master's degree in mathematics, statistics, and a PhD in applied statistics and economics from American University, Washington, D.C. Mr. Fofak has published extensively and is a member of some leading professional and scientific organizations, including the African Academy of Sciences and the American Economic Association. Please help me welcome him warmly. So I guess it will be appropriate to call him Dr. Hippolyte Fofak. So, Doc, the floor is yours. I yield the floor to you, as our young people will say.
On such an important topic, and I would in particular like to thank really CODA and IDEA, and of course the African Union for hosting this, what I call a very germane and timely conversations on African Monetary and Economic Conference. I have to say that reflecting on this, I've come to realize upfront, so that you know where I'm coming from, that it may turn out that monetary integrations may actually be more important for this continent than economic integrations. Perhaps we've been putting the cart before the horse, So it's fitting to really thank Koda once again and IDEA for bringing us together to reflect on something that is so fundamental for this continent, which is really at a crossroad. At a crossroad because when we got into post-independence, per capita income was actually higher in Africa than in Asia. Today we are in a world whereby 60% of world poor are within the African continent, not in Asia. So the developing world are essentially become, to a large extent, Africa. It's also timely because we are engaging discussions at a time where there is a lot of conversation about reforming the international financial systems. And quite frankly, that system has become a major constraint to economic expansions and development within the African continent. And among the region of the world, the one that's been the most adversely affected by that systems, in my view, it's Africa. Ironically, Africa is also the region that has surrendered its monetary sovereignty the most and remain highly marginalized in the global currency landscape. And this is, when you look at the currency landscape, this is what we have. Dominance is the dollar, the euros. These two currencies account for almost 80% of foreign reserve. And then we have the pound and the yen. And if you look at the hierarchy of this currency, the dollar is on top, the euro, and below the euro, you have those two. So that's the architecture, the currency dominating the world. I think having central bank a national currency no longer guarantees monetary sovereignty in our financially globalized world. In fact, the influence of a few reserve currency has undermined the Westphalian conception of monetary sovereignty at a huge cost to developing countries, which are affected by policy move of major institutions such as the Fed dominance at the global level. The IFS exposed African countries to recurrent balance of payment crisis, debt crisis, which are, in my view, an inevitable outcome of the long-term deterioration of commodity terms of trade, the growth-crushing borrowing rate, and balance of payment constraint imposed by dollar funding. Think of Nigeria, where they have rationing because there's no dollar, almost on a monthly basis. So referring to the international financial system, which he qualified as morally bankrupt, UN Secretary General once remarked that realizing Africa's potential requires overcoming a series of challenges. Chief among them, he said, is the dysfunctional and unfair global financial system that denies many African countries the debt relief and consumer financing that they need. In fact, in my view, the system does not just deny both concessional financing, but also financing on comparable terms. I once asked an IMF colleague that what will happen to Italy if instead of paying 2% on their debt, they were paying 10% or 15% like an African country. His answer was clear, Italy will default. Here we have 10-year government bond. Germany is paying 2.2%. And your home country, Chairman, it's at 20%. So that's the system in which we are. Over the years, the dysfunctional IFS has actually emerged, in my view, as the greatest constraint to development within Africa. By holding the region in a debt trap, it has shrunk Africa's fiscal space, undermined the scope of public investment that expand human capital, physical capital, digital capital, and entrepreneurial capital, access to credit, to level required to crowd in private capital to diversify the source of growth and enhance regional integration into the global economy. In fact, we look at the number of scientists per million, per inhabitant. Africa has about 100 scientists per million, compared to more than 2,000 in Asia and 4,000 in Europe. Those are the skills we need to transform economy, yet we simply don't have enough because of that constraining fiscal space that the current system put Africa under. The IFS has also set Africa on the path of recurrent debt crisis. Even after the HIPC initiative, Africa is on the verge of another debt crisis, even though it has deployed the lowest amount of support to mitigate the COVID-19 pandemic. Think about it, 60 billion for the African continent, $4.2 trillion for Europe, and 14 trillion for the US, for $35 trillion for the US. This is quite remarkable that Europe has spent 14 trillion, America 35 trillion, and yet we have a debt issue within the African continent. Africa debt to GDP ratio is around 68% compared to 88% and 120% in the USA. Despite this figure, Africa is the region of the world with the largest number of countries almost in debt distress. In fact, 60% of countries declared as such are within the African continent. Yet, this includes Ethiopia, one of the world's fastest growing economies. They managed to expand by 6% in 2020 at the height of the pandemic and forecast to grow by over 8% in 2024. They have defaulted on their loan. The key question we have, why will a country enjoying robust economic growth default on its debt to enter an IMF program? I think this is a fundamental question that we should really mitigate on, reflect on. And my answer is the chronic deficit of monetary sovereignty that disproportionately exposes Ethiopia to the entrenched inequality of the financial system is the answer. And the story of Ethiopia is the story of Africa under the constraint imposed by the international financial system. In essence, by surrendering of monetary sovereignty, Africa has jeopardized prospect for economic sovereignty, the capacity of country to make decisions in relation to economic policy at significant cost to development. In fact, following an overview of this international financial system, we actually focused on what it takes to achieve effective monetary sovereignty and put Africa on the path of sustainable transformations. And so I think I will go very quickly when I look at international financial system for us to spend more time on the next three sections: monetary integration as a path to sovereignty, an Africa path to monetary sovereignty, and expected benefit of monetary sovereignty within the African continent. And in terms of overview quickly, I think it's quite fair to say that since the end of World War II, especially after Nixon's, the US dollar from gold in 1961, the US currency has been the cornerstone of the international financial systems. As the world reserve currency, it has been used for trade, international finance, and as a preferred reserve currency held by nations. Reflecting on the power of network effect, it still accounts for 90% of currency trading, despite the ongoing shift toward multipolarity and de-dollarizations. This is quite significant. The impact of the network effect, which pull us toward the US dollar, despite the ongoing geopolitical tectonic shift around the world. Look at the currency share of foreign reserve. The dollar has been losing ground, but it's about 59% as we speak, from over 72% 25 years ago. And when you combine the dollar and the euro, you're at 80%. If you add the yen, Japanese yen, and the British pound, you're almost at 94%. So those are the four currencies that I mentioned at opening. You see their impact in terms of reserve holding. Financing extended to country by MDBs, not just the World Bank, but also African Development Bank, African Bank, the AIB, Inter-American Development Bank, is in general in US dollars. So access to affordable USD has been the most binding constraint, as we mentioned. So in the absence of social transformation, African economy are still large natural resource base, depend on access to USD more than any other region of the world, relying heavily on import for both final consumptions, but also intermediate goods. And think of it that 90% of drugs that we use in the continent are actually imported, and 99% of vaccine are imported. So without the US dollar, we cannot afford this critical good. Furthermore, while other regions of the world, including Asia, where digitalization is bolstering the use of local currency for cross-border payments and settlement, do not rely heavily on USD for intra-regional trade. USD is actually required even for intra-African trade. And look at Europe, they've been able to use essentially the euro for intra-EU trade. And this is the African financing of African trade. So it was 51% the dollar and 26% euro in 2013. 5 years later, not much has changed. We still need this foreign currency to really finance trade within the African continent, the currency that we do not have. Naturally, countries that do not have access to the USD have difficulty promoting trade, investment, growth, and transformations, all of which are conditions upon access to affordable patient capital. This involves currency, all countries across the continent, and where the financing gap, annual financing gap is 120 billions, and the financing gap for sustained development is much larger, $1.3 trillion. Issuing reserve currency is the preserve of a few countries, an inequality that confine Africa to the demand side of the supply and demand equations in the global credit money system and the international monetary order. And so entrenched bias in the issue of reserve currency, which confer exorbitant privilege to advanced economy while acting as a constraint to growth in the global south, specifically within the African continent at huge cost. The costs are significant. I will mention just few. The fact that debt crises have become a recurrent problem to the African continent, even though our share of global debt is the lowest. The fact that access to long-term capital has been a major constraint to transformations in a continent where paying interest rate charge, which are 5 to 10% higher than what countries in Europe are actually paying for. And this one is very significant. The original sins of borrowing in foreign currency, which actually expose country to currency risk and increase the risk of debt overhang, which is a consequence of that asymmetry in the issuance of foreign reserve. And think about that, more than 80% of African country debt is denominated in either euros or the USD, which as a result, monetary policy undertaken by those countries have impact on us, as we've seen lately. And the key question we have is that can monetary and economic sovereignty be achieved when country liabilities are denominated in foreign currency? Can that happen? Can that happen? Now, the Fed latest cycle monetary tightening led to currency gyration and depreciation within the African continent. I think Nigeria lost 70% of Naira, has lost more than 70% of its value, but it's across the continent. If you look at the index for all African currency, it's quite significant within the span of a year or two. The next thing, in terms of implication, the preeminence of the USD is also responsible for excess capital flows volatility and inordinate outflows from developing countries, and which have implications in terms of investment, growth, and economic development, including in the infrastructure sector. Furthermore, I think that reliance on dollars, where they have an ordering and hierarchy of currency, some currencies are more important than others, tend to drive the capital flight and flows, and the continent in Africa is actually losing about $88 billion a year. I think SWAT has been very good at really focusing on this as laser beam, because there's no need to be going for loans when we have $88 billion leaving the continent every single year. And on the balkanized African monetary landscape has actually inhibited the growth of liquid secondary market in Africa, sovereign bond, sustaining that demand for US dollars and driving the leakages. But I think on these sections, perhaps the most insidious of all costly and pernicious perception premium, which actually inflate the risk of Africa, therefore setting the continent on the path of default-driven borrowing rates that we mentioned earlier. The credit rating agencies actually penalize Africa dramatically. Very few African countries are rated, and among those rated, 93% are junk, including Ethiopia, Kenya, and Nigeria, as we speak. And believe it or not, on the COVID, the three rating agencies actually downgraded African countries, creating a pro-cyclical implications where we should be doing the counter-cyclical move to support country. In addition to inhibiting growth and deterring investment, these rates actually increase the fiscal incidence of external debt, undermining economic sovereignty that we are so much looking for. And talking about high interest rate and cost, I think this year we will spend $75 billion on interest payments, which has become the largest item in budget, exceeding healthcare. So under the current IFS, I think in which no African currency has global standing and no African central bank can act as a lender or market maker of last resort, monetary sovereignty has become really illusory. We think we have it, but we simply do not within the regions. In the absence of monetary sovereignty, economic sovereignty has been elusive as well. And on the industrialized Africa remained the most natural resource dependent, as we heard yesterday from the keynote, with the median commodity dependence of more than 90% compared to 22% in Europe. While monetary sovereignty is likely to set Africa on the path of economic sovereignty is impossible in the absence of monetary sovereignty. That's why I said this conference is so timely, because it has led us to think, to realize that we may have been putting the cart before the horse. This is commodity dependence. You can see where Africa is compared to the rest of the world. Monetary integrations as the path to monetary sovereignty in Africa. I think I'd like us to spend some time on this. I think most, if not all, African countries have national central bank and national currency. In fact, when I look at the global map of currency, 33% of currency in circulations worldwide are within the African continent. So the balkanizations or the monetary landscape is quite significant. But no African country can claim to actually enjoy the benefit of monetary sovereignty, even in an effective sense, let alone in the Westphalian sense. I think the Westphalian conception of monetary sovereignty refer to the ability of states to issue their own currency, as well as regulate its use within their border. But with financial globalization and creeping dollarizations, national borders have become very porous, as we know. We have dollarization subjecting country to actually essentially US monetary policy. We have government all over the world which are contending with bondholder and IMF policy conditionalities. We have public money which has become a fraction of global money supply, with private financial institutions playing an increasingly important role in the issuance of offshore money. So really, it's difficult for one country to actually claim to have monetary sovereignty in the Westphalian sense today. That's why we move toward effective monetary sovereignty. Reflecting this development in the internet financial system, I think the BIS had called for the end of the triple coincidence whereby economic area, monetary area, and decision-making area all fall within single territory. With the changing financial landscape and increasing reality of dollarizations and permanence of reserve currency, monetary sovereignty has repeatedly been declared dead. So on a deepening process of globalizations and financial integrations, the increasing prominence of the reserve currency has relegated the Westphalian conception of monetary sovereignty to a distant past is something that is no longer realistic. So why is the third conference, African Economic Conference, focusing on monetary sovereignty if the concept is dead, Madam Sowat? I think the short answer is that monetary sovereignty has taken a different form in a financially globalized world of increasing currency competitions. I think currency competitions is a key word here. States are competing fiercely to foster widespread usage of instruments denominated in the national unit of account. In its drive to internationalize the rupee, the Reserve Bank of India has actually allowed banks from 22 African countries, including Tanzania and Kenya, to actually open special Vostro rupee account to settle payment in rupees. And countries enjoying the privilege of reserve currency are prepared to do whatever it takes to preserve it. I think this is very important. You may have heard recently when President Trump threatened to sanction anyone who move away from the US dollars. Okay, Trump has arrived. It takes time to get Trump to come on stage. I think Trump is actually threatening us to say that you must use a dollar, otherwise you're going to be punished. If he says this, it means that they have interest in the rest of the world using the dollar, isn't it? Issuing a reserve currency confers immense economic and geopolitical power on the US, not least the use of US government debt as currency reserve and private sector's collateral, which allow the US to finance its debt level at much lower rates than either Nigeria or Kenya or any country, or Ethiopia, any country within the continent. The US is also one of the few countries that can claim to enjoy effective monetary sovereignty in the world today, because essentially it's increasingly determined by the volume of onshore and offshore financial transactions carried out in your currency. That's how we define monetary sovereignty today. The volume of this transaction determines the hierarchical positions of the monetary area, which in turn shape the position of the country in the international hierarchy of money. The higher up in that hierarchy of money, the greater the ability of a given state to effectively use its tool of monetary governance to achieve economic policy objective. On that hierarchy, I think the US is way up. Then we have immediately below that, we have the euro, the European Union, and which has the largest, after the US dollar, amount of currency, foreign reserve actually denominated in euros. And even though Belgium lost its monetary sovereignty in a Westphalian sense, by joining the Eurozone, it nonetheless has greater flexibility in adapting the monetary policy strategy to changing macro-financial environment. Therefore, Belgium has more effective monetary sovereignty than any African country which still has its national bank and national currency. And this is the hierarchy of money that we see today. As we mentioned, we have the US dollar on top, and right underneath, and if you push one step further, you have the Chinese yuan, the Brazilian real, the Danish krone, and the Swiss franc as the third layers. But we took these four because they actually capture more than 90% of foreign exchange reserve. The ECB is one of the most important central banks in the world, and countries that fall under the euro umbrella enjoy effective monetary sovereignty than other EU countries that are not part of the Union. And China, which has been rapidly moving up the apex of international hierarchy of unit account, also enjoy great flexibility. You just have to see the scope of stimulus, fiscal and monetary stimulus, that China is injecting into its economy. No African country can afford such an injections. In its drive to international renminbi, China is developing cross-border payment system and extending swap line. And after including China into the IMF basket in 2014, the IMF recently raised its weightage to about 13%. So China is actually moving up in that hierarchy and yielding significant benefit. Amid rising financial globalization and continental states, monetary sovereignty is increasingly dictated by the use of one currency in international trade and finance. And this is very important. In a mutually reinforcing relationship, greater economic power enhances monetary sovereignty. A monetary sovereignty loosens balance of payment constraint associated with dollar funding, and this in turn empowers government officials with greater degrees of freedom in economic management and monetary governance. In a world of increasing currency competition, the balkanization African currency landscape is actually a constraint to monetary sovereignty and economic sovereignty. And what is the path? And this is where I would like us to spend some time now. How do we move to that monetary sovereignty within the African? I think effective monetary sovereignty is now based not only on the ability of central bank to act as a lender last resort, but also and increasingly as a market maker of that result. Remember what happened last year. In the last cycle of interest rate hike, widening spread in countries such as Italy, the ECB established a transmission protection mechanism to counter financial fragmentations following normalizations. As a result, the spread actually narrowed, reducing the fiscal burden of Italy's debt. Although Italy's debt is more than $3 trillion, it can afford it because it's actually under the umbrella of that system important central bank, which is able to put pressure, downward pressure on spread to sustain demand for bond. No African central bank can play a similar role in our current highly balkanized monetary landscape. But monetary integration can provide the path to monetary sovereignty, establishing an African central bank that serves both as a lender and market maker of that resort. I think establishing that central bank has been a lofty goal for most African leaders and the founding fathers. I think it goes back to the Abuja Treaty, and which said the last step on the integration should be the creation of an African currency. But we had several challenges along the way. I'll just mention a few in the interest of time. I think there are geopolitical, there are short-term thinking, and the shortage of political will, but also the unrealistic approach to technical criteria. And I will focus on the technical criteria. I think beyond reducing economic policy in the region to short-term balance payment management, it's very important to stress that the technical criteria made it very difficult to actually achieve that monetary integrations, and whether it is exchange rate stability, price stability, or budget deficit. And countries across the continent are subject to asymmetric shocks, making it difficult to achieve synchronous convergence. At the same time, the shocks are actually triggered by the US Fed or dynamic commodity market. And the ongoing transition toward multipolar world actually accelerate digitalizations, make it very important to draw on the AFCFTA to push for that monetary integration and strengthen the will. The first step in our view would be to realize that the impossibility of consistently achieving synchronous macroeconomic convergence, that is essentially infinite convergence, whereby macroeconomic convergence becomes the stationary state across the whole continent, is just not possible. And after the Greece financial crisis, we now know that these criteria were never met when they integrated the Eurozone, nor were they even considered what Alexander Hamilton pushed for integration within the US. What put Europe and the US on the path of effective monetary sovereignty was the political will, and the EU monetary integration was also realized in the context of financial globalizations. And one important driver was mitigating the risk of competitive devaluations. And that risk today is a major constraint to the implementation of the AFCFTA. And the commitment to realize the full benefit of CFTA, which have the potential to accelerate diversification of growth and boost intra-African trade, should strengthen the will But in the immediate short term, I think it's very important to quickly establish the African Monetary Union. I think Eurozone experience also shows that integration works when we have large economy leading it. Bringing France and Germany together was a major catalyst. And in the African context, we should expect Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa to play that role. In the short term, I think digitalization should enable us to actually draw on technology to reduce transaction costs and actually achieve cross-border payment the way Asia has done recently. At the same time, local currency settlement should be promoted aggressively. I think Africa could save up to $5 billion a year immediately by relying on local currency to promote cross-border trade. The country should also draw on technology to establish swap arrangement and invest in harmonizing standard unified payment system. But if there's one lesson to be taken away from Eurozone experience, it is that monetary integration in Africa will only succeed in the function if there is fiscal federalism. Countries should also draw on, in fact, let me just move to expected benefit and then close. It's quite clear that the welfare on a country which has a reserve currency are unambiguously higher than otherwise. And we saw that in the Eurozone. I think the Reserve Bank of India is actually expected to save $30 billion just by importing crude oil from Russia in local currency. Besides the welfare gain, I think development impact are also significant. The issue of current account deficit, seniorage, expansion of trade investment opportunity within the African continent, increased confidence in the African currency. This is very important to reduce the capital flight and illicit outflows. Reduce the burden of maintaining large foreign exchange reserve as a self-protection mechanism. And the cost of that already in the 2000 was in the $300 billion annually. And the issue of stability of the financial system, which has been a shortage of foreign assets, and the issue of development of local corporate bond market to mitigate risk. Original sin is another benefit. And accelerating liquid single market sovereign corporate monetary integration will also reduce financial leakages while supporting AFCFTA implementations. In essence, monetary integration mitigate the risk of a competitive valuations in the AFCFTA era. We provide afford patient capital needed to accept transformations of African economy and bolster intra-African trade. Conclusion, I think for a decade, financing has been the most important bargaining constraint to development in Africa. The region has been the prime victim of financial operations, also emerging as vulnerable to debt crisis. With financial globalization relegating the Westphalian conception of monetary sovereignty to distant past, the rise of system-important central bank that enjoy pre-issue reserve currency as well as marginalized African currency and central bank in the global monetary order. The reliance of African country on external financing actually reduced African central bank to rule takers at huge cost that we just mentioned. And the few countries whose central bank have the power to issue reserve currency have emerged as the one enjoying effective monetary sovereignty with the currency used global trade, finance transactions, and reserve currency. More than 80% of global foreign reserve are not held in euro and US dollars. In our world of financial globalization, effective monetary integration has become the path to economic sovereignty and global convergence. A growing number of developing countries are actively working to internationalize their currency and reap the benefit of effective monetary sovereignty. More than ending the balkanization of African monetary landscape, monetary sovereignty, monetary integration will help set the regions on the path of effective monetary sovereignty, strengthen the foundation of economic sovereignty in the era of globalizations. In essence, monetary integration has become the necessary conditions for effective sovereignty and development in Africa. Beside its huge economic benefit, most notably macroeconomic stability, reduced opportunity cost of precautionary reserve holding, it also have the potential to accelerate implementation of the AFCFTA and will bring geopolitical power to the regions, the way the dollar has to the US. In fact, but however, marshalling the political will to transcend the illusion of monetary sovereignty born out of independence in the post-colonial era is crucial if Africa is to achieve the sort of monetary integration dreamed by the founding father. With African monetary integration, the new global monetary order will change for the better with an African currency in the midst. This is how it will look like. And this could happen in 10, 15 years, 20 years, if there is will and commitment. But I also see in that new order, emerging order, the Brazilian real, the Russian ruble should be part of this. But the Africa in the middle, that will be the African currency for the signal to be determined. I wanted to end this on the most important of all African founding father, Kwame Nkrumah. Let me read it. Unite we must. Without necessarily sacrificing our sovereignty, we can forge a political union based on defense, foreign affairs, diplomacy, common citizenship, an African currency, a monetary zone and central bank. We must unite in order to achieve the full liberations of the continent. So the geopolitical power that we mentioned is summarized. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
That has been a very powerful presentation and one that I'm extremely keen for us to unbundle. So for that reason, I've had to appeal to Dr. Andres Arauz to keep his presentation as short as possible so that everybody can dig in and get their questions in so that we can get the best out of it. He has generously and kindly agreed that he can limit the scope of his presentation without losing the essence of it. So he will deliver that presentation now, if we can go ahead with that, and then still we get a chance to unbundle this, because the fact is in the conversation rather than just a presentation.
Very, very, very quickly, I had prepared a few slides on how we got here, and so you'll have to forgive me, and that's why I wanted to click myself so that I can go faster. It's important to mention that gold is still the very important element of international settlement of currencies. We have seen central banks acquiring gold, gold being again the instrument to settle monetary transactions in the context of overreach of financial sanctions, particularly from the United States and the European Union. Gold has not left the scene of international currency settlement, and it has been there for a while, and it will probably stick around for a while. So this is important. There is not just the physical gold for settlement of international transactions. There's what we call paper gold. I don't know if we can fix that again. Thank you. Paper gold in the sense that we have gold deposits, or virtual gold in the sense that they are transactional records or accounting records either in the Bank of England or at the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. So gold is still on the table, and any sort of construction of an international or regional monetary union should not forget that gold will have a role in terms of supporting the reserves of the union. Again, so we can't forget that dollar was tied to gold in the context of the Bretton Woods agreements, and as Dr. Fofak mentioned, in '71, this conversion unilaterally ended. But if you analyze the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve banks, the clearing mechanism between the Federal Reserve banks of the United States is a yearly exchange of gold accounts. So it's still there, even when in the context of the dollar. I already talked a lot about the SDR the day before, and we had some conferences yesterday about it as well. But I also wanted to emphasize one aspect, and it's the top line over there. The SDR is not just the SDR monetary instrument. The SDR is also a unit of account. And this is absolutely crucial when we talk about money, Because the first step to having monetary sovereignty is to have a unit of account. And the fact that the SDR has its own unit of account means that even if we don't have access to SDRs, the instrument, we can have SDRs denominated balance sheets. And we can create endogenous money denominated in SDRs. Okay? So the possibilities are important. And here we can learn experiences, for example, from the Arab Monetary Fund, where the Arab dinar is linked or pegged to the SDR. Okay? So the importance of having the unit of account broader than just the monetary instrument is very, very important. I have an upcoming article which will be published in Foreign Policy, and probably today or next week, that talks about the need for the United Nations to update its accounting standards. Right now, all of the United Nations bodies, agencies, balance sheets are denominated in US dollars. Even though the IMF is a UN agency, and its official unit of account is the SDR, which in terms of the ISO currency code, just like USD is for the dollar, for the SDR is the XDR. So we can make a very, very, very strong push with something that seems absolutely technical and minor, which is updating the accounting standard, the unit of account of the United Nations agencies and the entire statistical reporting standard. Now, yesterday we talked a lot about climate finance, but I saw one element that was absolutely missing. And it's the arrangement and the intersection between dollar hegemony and the energy markets, right? You cannot forget that energy is quoted in dollars. There was a freaking war about this in 2003 when the invasion of Iraq was largely about the fact that Iraq decided to quote its energy sales in euros. Or do we forget that France and Germany did not support that war precisely because it gave them also monetary sovereignty over the energy of that country, or the oil coming from Iraq. And it was, of course, going to set an example in terms of diversifying the quoting of the energy in different currencies. That is why Trump says dollar only, because part of the exorbitant privilege is the fact that the issuer of the dollar can acquire the materiality of energy by issuing fictitious capital. Unlike any other country, those for where we come from, if we want to acquire fuel from the world markets, first we have to sell bananas to get those dollars. Or we have to sell our bodies. Or we have to sell our natural resources so that we can get the dollars, so that we can acquire energy. But not one country, the one that had the petrodollar arrangement. So this is absolutely important in terms of the biophysical implications of dollar exorbitant privilege. The European Union had a consultation in 2019 that they said, should there be such a thing as the petro-euro? And the technical responses were, yeah, but we don't want to get the US too mad, so let's postpone that discussion. And they even took that off of the European Union website. You can find it using the archive, but they took it out of the European Union website. If you want the link, just let me know. And then, of course, we have dollarization, both as the concept of dollarization of cross-border trade, but also dollarization of many national economies, where, for example, in my own country, the dollar is actually the official currency for use within our economies. And in the case of Latin America, we have several of them, Puerto Rico included. Now, this is an important element here, and why we have to go a little bit just beyond the monetary and economic justification for monetary sovereignty, we need to understand that there are many other dimensions, like I explained, the relation to energy, but also now the relation to economic power. When we talk about the title of this section of the conference, de-dollarization, it's not just switching the unit of account, right? That would seem trivial. We have to find the political economy of this. And the political economy is that you have to diversify away from the main mega banks that are the international correspondent banks that we saw a couple of days ago, these very clear 13 banks that will not be happily endorsing an alternative, but they will radically oppose that by all means necessary. And you have established payment system networks that benefit from that dollar hegemony, that are mainly US-based remittance, credit card companies, payment companies, increasingly in the digital sphere, bridging the tech world and the finance world. These are the foundational members of the so-called Better Than Cash Alliance that formally declared a war on cash. And we'll see why this is important. This will be a very, very short technical digression, and that is crucial to understand why money payment systems are triangular in nature. And unlike what we think of money, that it flows from place A to B as if it traveled in an airplane somewhere, and usually see these a dollar bill moving from place A to place B, money is a social relation, right? Every time you transfer money, you are actually killing money in the point of origin. You have to kill it in the accounting. You have to destroy it first so that it can be created in the point of destination. And that process is triangular in nature because the middle entity is the one that guarantees, with the trust of the 2 points of origin and destination, that money destruction and money creation takes place in an ordered manner, guaranteeing that there's an equilibrium. That triangular point of mutual trust is called the correspondent bank. Now, when you have it within the same bank, it's two people that have two accounts in the same bank, the transaction is easy. But when you have people that have accounts in different banks, you need another common bank to mediate between the two banks. Usually, that's the central bank. And that's the world that we are used to. But increasingly, you've had this arrangement that was based on central banks and having a common central bank among the central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, settle international payments. Unfortunately, now it is those mega banks, commercial banks, based in the United States and Europe primarily, that are serving as the replacement of central banks for the international settlement of international transactions. So when we talk about monetary sovereignty, it is not just looking for sovereignty in the Westphalian sense. We have to seek sovereignty and redistribution of economic and political power from the mega banks that have now basically created this power, this concentration of power. Now, the concentration of power, as you can see here, is not just around the fact that the banks hoard the liquidity, the mega banks. It's that they control the information of those transactions. You see? Because there are millions and millions and millions of transactions every day. And if you had that information, you could do very nice little econometric studies and big data studies. You wish you had that, but who does have that information? I have to skip some of this stuff. Okay, who has that information? Well, if every time you use your Visa credit card or debit card, it doesn't just remain in your bank statement. It's information that's aggregated in the Visa data centers in the United States. Visa is a US company. All of our information that we use the Visa debit cards, even if we are in Kampala or Nairobi or in Addis or in Delhi, a copy of every single one of our transactions is stored in the Visa data centers in the US. And the USA Patriot Act mandates that the National Security Agency of the United States can have not just backdoor, but front door access to that database. The same with SWIFT. This is from 12 years ago when Snowden revealed that the NSA had access to all of the international transactions, every single transaction, personal or business, government, military purchases, everything. There is a system in the NSA called FinInt, Financial Intelligence, where they can just put your last name, your ID, your account number, and everything related and connected to you will show up. This is not recent. This is from 12 years ago. Imagine what they have now. Okay? So this is a description of how, this is what Snowden leaked. All you have to do is put your name in, with a lucky strike, that's the system they called, everything comes up. The systems are called Lucky Strike and Lucky Escape. They have another system called TrackFin that's based in the UK. They did that to basically close the accounts of Canadian protesters in Canada. They even applied that to the cryptocurrency world with Chainalysis. And the CIA most recently also revealed the financial data surveillance mechanism. And this is very important. Most transactions, international transactions, are channeled through the SWIFT mechanism. The SWIFT mechanism is basically an email system between banks. It's not so much more sophisticated than that. And it follows a certain standard on how the financial information should be ordered. Your name, your account number, the date, the value, whatever. And SWIFT supposedly is a neutral institution based coincidentally in Belgium, but it's owned by the private banks. And the United States pushed the European Union to pass a specific directive that authorizes the company SWIFT to share all of its information with the United States Treasury. See, the Ethiopian Central Bank doesn't have a copy of all the SWIFT data, not even the European national central banks, but the United States Treasury gets a copy of every single SWIFT transaction, authorized by the European Union. And I'm about to conclude here. Okay, so the surveillance aspect of it is absolutely crucial because we need another justification sometimes when we talk to politicians and say, do you really want to give away all of your citizens' information? Do you really want to give away all of your businesses' information? Do you really want to give away all of your government and military transactional information? No, we need information sovereignty, and monetary sovereignty is also essential for that purpose. This will open the doors of many unexpected allies in our national governments. And finally, of course, we want to drive away from this system. Lula calls for the end of this dollar privilege and exorbitant privilege dominance, but how do we make this happen? There are many initiatives, just like the Arab Monetary Fund, the Asian countries. This is not something radical or new or isolated or, here are a bunch of crazy people proposing this in this room. No, this is what's happening in the rest of the world. We are late in the game. We have to get the payment systems rolling. It is not hard, and we have to make it happen really fast. Finally, just this slide here. The dollar is still hegemonic, as Dr. Fofak said. We cannot lie to ourselves and say that, now people are trading in rupee and yuan or yen. No, the reality is dollar is still king. And this is just a comparison of the CIPS, which is the Chinese interbank payment system, versus the CHIPS, which is the clearinghouse of the dollar-based world, the interbank clearinghouse in the United States. And you can see, of course, the magnitude of a couple of recent statistics. Even, there has been important growth in the Chinese interbank payment system. The role of the dollar is absolutely hegemonic, as you can see. Here I end, which is the important need, just like in the African Union, there are efforts to build regional monetary sovereignty. In Latin America, we also have these efforts that have successively failed, and I wish that we could share the mistakes that we have made in the past, so that we don't have to repeat those mistakes here, and vice versa. We are now trying to build the SUR initiative proposed by President Lula of Brazil, which is how to have a payment system based on a unit of account that is hopefully pegged to the SDR, and that would allow for fast payments and real-time gross settlement of payments intra-Latin America that can be sold to our population as mostly tech innovation, but that can also at the same time build degrees of sovereignty and policies face, so that we can ease the balance of payments restrictions that we face in our societies. Thank you very much.